Our next speaker, which I'm especially delighted and honored to host today at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, is Dr. Tariq Haddad, who in February 2024 refused to meet with Secretary Blinken in protest of the ongoing support of Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Dr. Tariq Haddad is a practicing cardiologist in Northern Virginia, where he serves as director of research at Virginia Heart and as assistant professor of medical education at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Dr. Haddad grew up as a child in the Gaza Strip, in the town of Khan Yunis, among hundreds of his extended family, before moving to Saudi Arabia later in his youth, and then continuing his education in the United States during high school and beyond. He received his undergraduate degree from Duke University and receiving his medical degree in 2000, and he also received, he received his undergraduate degree from Duke University and then attended medical school at Cornell University Medical College. He received his cardiology training at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, and since that time has been living in Northern Virginia with his wife and 5 children. Dr. Haddad has over 100 members of his family who have been killed by the Israeli military bombings of Gaza. So this is not something that is just in the abstract or on television for thousands of Palestinian Americans and their friends and their family and their colleagues. And so with that, we are truly privileged to have Dr. Haddad here to provide us with both the personal story, but also the professional perspective as a highly accomplished doctor in the United States. Thank you so much, Dr. Haddad. The floor is yours.
It's my honor to be here. And thank you, Josh, for your wonderful, really insightful discussion. I think, purpose of my talk is to really provide some background on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It really put it in the context for those who maybe aren't as familiar with Gaza, so you can understand why we got to where we are today. So just as a background, how did we get to this current crisis? I think there's 3 really critical factors for people to understand for how we are where we are right now. I think a lot of people who are unfamiliar, they see the current humanitarian crisis and they say, my goodness, it seemed to go from 0 to 100 in 4 months. And that's just not the case, right? So there's 3 big factors. I think one is the effect of the refugee crisis in 1948, when 800,000 Palestinians were dispossessed and transferred by Israeli militias during the creation of Israel, and the effect that had on Gaza. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Over 200,000 of those 800,000 actually were transferred to Gaza and moved to Gaza. Which causes most of Gaza's population to be refugees. Secondly, we'll talk about the Israeli occupation of Gaza in '67, what effect that's had on the current humanitarian crisis. And then finally, the third major factor before we get to October is the Israeli blockade on Gaza. And it's happened since 2007 by land, sea, and air. I or my family has experienced literally every one of these factors. And so I can talk from a personal standpoint as well. So this is a slide that sits in my study. This is a picture in my study from the UN archives that I purchased several years ago. This is a picture of 4 children in 1952 in a refugee camp in Gaza, studying by candlelight, ironically, in conditions that are better than many of their kids right now in refugee camps in Gaza. These are the same refugee camps where these children sit that still exist to this day. These are all children who lived in, or their parents lived in 1948 Israel, northern Israel, and they moved here with the expectation of being able to go back to their homes, and they never did. This is 1952. This is a picture of my family in the late 60s. My grandmother is on the top right, my grandfather on the bottom right. And the reason I put this picture in here, my grandmother was the headmaster of the United Nations schools in Gaza. So she is my direct connection to what happened to these refugees starting in 1948. The stories we would hear, the harrowing stories, all of her students, for the most part, were refugees. And they would be asking her because they could never go back to their homes. They knew their homes were in Haifa and Jaffa and Akka, and they could never go back. And so they would ask her to educate them on their homes, on their lands. And she would get beaten in her schools by Israeli soldiers for telling the truth, for telling her students where their parents were from and educating them, because the Israeli military, it was in their best interest to make students think that they are from where they live now, and not where their parents were transferred from. So this is a map showing the original villages of Gaza's refugees. Again, this is extremely important background to understand why we are where we are. So you can see all the yellow dots are where all the original villages were that Gaza's refugees are from. They go all over, as you can see, in 1948 Israel. And you know, 202,000 Palestinians out of those 800,000 were transferred or got displaced to Gaza. So those 202,000 are now on 1% of historic Palestine. And they were all forced essentially into 8 refugee camps, all of which exist to this day that you hear about every day on the news. So these are the 8 refugee camps you can see, and tragically, all 8, again, are all there, and every one of them has been bombed during this current assault. These are all people who grew up in refugee camps from the 40s and 50s. These are the original villages of Gaza's refugees. I'm not going to list them all, but just to point out that there are literally almost 200 villages that these people are all coming from. So shifting over to the Israeli occupation. So again, the first step was, you know, all of Gaza, or most of them, are refugees, and they've lived this existence as refugees their whole lives. You add to that the occupation of 1967, and this is a bar graph that shows Israelis and Palestinians killed, extending back to around 1988 or so. And what you see here, what I really want you to highlight, what I really want to highlight is this never started in October. You can see here the deaths of Palestinians number in the hundreds yearly, going back, and you can extend this graph back before the 80s. You know, I experienced this myself. I grew up there as a child. You know, the effects of the occupation, unless you've lived under them, you have no idea. Every aspect of your life is controlled by the Israeli military. Your travel is restricted. Your ability to build homes, your ability to create an economy. You can't build a restaurant without a permit that never comes. You're under military law. So, you know, I've had cousins who've been jailed indefinitely, you know, as children without trial. You know, I've had rubber bullets fired at me. I've had tear gas fired at me, and had to have perfume in every room in our house, because that's the only way you can keep it from singeing your throat. You take 18 hours to do a journey that takes 45 minutes. Every aspect of your life is controlled by the military occupation, and it is impossible to grow as an economy with an occupation like this that extends for over 60 years. You fast forward now to 2007, and the third major factor, which is the Israeli blockade on Gaza. So starting in 2007, after Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip, Israel made the decision to occupy Gaza from outside rather than from the inside. So I call it a disengagement, because that's really by definition what it is. They continued to occupy Gaza, and what I mean by that is walls were built on 3 sides of the Gaza Strip. The other side, which is the coast, had a fishing restriction. In some areas, no more than 6 nautical miles for you fishermen. That means the only thing you can fish is small fish. You cannot fish for your family larger fish. Water limitations, almost all water was coming from Israel, and those water limitations were well under the World Health Organization minimum standards, and which I'll talk about in a few slides. Electricity for no more than about 4 hours a day. My parents would only be able to call me during those 4 hours. Restricted imports of food and medications. High rates of malnutrition and PTSD, as much as 90%, depending on the study, rates of PTSD among children. And 97% of the water supply since this Israeli blockade has been unfit for human consumption. 97%. This is all the effects of the blockade, heading back decades. These are some statistics from the World Health Organization. First slide is looking at essential drugs that are literally, without them, one has a risk of death. And you can see what percent of essential drugs have a stock of less than 1 month in the Gaza Strip. And this is data from 2022 and 2023. And you can see the data shows around 45 to 50%. Almost half of the time of these drugs don't have a stock of more than 1 month. The bottom is waiting times for ear, nose, throat surgery at Shifa Hospital, which is in the news today because it's being bombed again. And you can see the wait times in 2022, 2023, you're talking 15 months on average to have a surgery. 15 months. This is well before October. Water, sanitation, and hygiene, again, before October, you can see the WHO standards, 100 liters of water per day. That is the international standard for all the water that one person needs for showering, cleaning, laundry, cooking, and drinking, right? And the WHO standard, we are well below that in Gaza, 2017, 2018, about 70 liters a day, and of which most is not fit for human consumption. Most of this is water that's not potable, that you're just using for other purposes other than drinking. And then electricity, 4 hours a day. This is 2017 data by the WHO, in the neighborhood of up to as low as 4 hours a day of electricity. The Rafah border crossing with Egypt, which is essentially for most Palestinians the only way to travel back and forth, to have commerce, to do anything. This is data from 2017 and 2020. You can see on average, on a given month, it is open about in 2017, 4 days out of the month. If you have a child with cancer and you need to get treatment, you have 4 days out of 30 to get that child across to get chemotherapy. So how did these three factors lead to what the average Palestinian is like going into October? So this is Gaza as 100 people, so to speak. This is statistics based on that. So of 100, 70% of them are refugees because of the issues I discussed. 82% live in poverty. This is before October. 63% are food insecure. 95% don't have access to clean water. 47%, people forget this, 47% of Gaza are children. Nearly half. This is who is being attacked, women and children. 45% of these children have trauma, depression, and anxiety. And 37% report aircraft sounds as their biggest fear. Personal story, my nephew, Yusuf, was born in 2004, right in the middle of all these attacks. And to this day, he's now in the United States. To this day, when we pop popcorn, he winces. He winces because the sound of popcorn reminds him of the military strikes in Gaza. Because he's like any other child. They all have that PTSD. 53% again are adults, and then 38% of those adults have depression. So fast forwarding to the current attacks, I'm going to start with my personal story, and then I'll go into some of the statistics. These are some pictures of some of my family members. As Professor Aziz mentioned, I've lost over 100 family members and counting who've all been killed. These are some of the more poignant stories. So Dr. Tawfiq al-Farah from my mother's side, who's a physician, was killed with his brother, his wife, his brother-in-law, his 2 daughters, Reem and Hadad, his brother's 3 children, one of whom, Tuqa, who's on the right, she's the girl on the very far right who's in hijab. It was her wedding day, the day she was killed. Reem and Hadad, the second slide, the third one, Dan al-Farah, Dr. Tawfiq's wife, was pregnant when she was killed. This was 10 members of a multi-generation family, all killed in one strike. Some more members of my family that were killed: Hamad al-Farah, Nadian al-Farah, Hamad's daughter, who was also killed. A couple days after that, Hatim and Aziz al-Farah, another side of my mom's side of the family, 14 family members, all killed, 3 generations. The only one who survived, Hamza, was a child. He was the only one of the 3 generations who survived, and he survived with an amputation, and then he died several days later in the hospital because of the lack of medical care and inability to get access to medical care for his amputation. This is some more pictures of my mother's side of the family who were killed in one strike. My dad's side of the family were unfortunately not spared either. So this is my cousin Hani Hadad, who I used to play with as a child, his Croatian wife Vera, and his mother Anam in the top right. They were killed in November in an Israeli military strike, along with 2 of Hani's sisters, Hud and Wafah, who were teachers. Anam was found by her son, buried from the waist up, dead after the military strike. And Wafah was found basically in multiple pieces by her brother, all over the house. Hani, my cousin, bled to death the day after this because there weren't any hospitals for him to get medical care. This is my aunt, Naham. She was again killed. She used to cook for us every time we come to Gaza. This is one of my cousin's children, Zayn, who was killed in November at that age. Sanad Farra, another child of one of my cousins, used to love to dress up as a princess and loved Disney, and that's her on the right. Having been killed, Abdul Rahim Al Farra, another child, killed while he was trying to get to the hospital. He was with his family, parking at the hospital, and he was killed by a military strike. Samar Al Farra, another woman from my mom's side of the family, killed while getting her PhD. After she went where the Israelis asked her to go, to shelter in Rafah in a safe zone, and she was killed in the safe zone. Most recent harrowing story was from a 20-day-old infant of one of my cousins who froze to death. This is back in February, froze to death at 20 days old after 9 of his siblings were all already killed the previous week, and his father was already killed before that. The people who survived have had a fate worse than death. This is a letter that I actually passed to the State Department. This is a letter that my cousin received, and it says, I'll translate it for you. It says, to the residents of Northern Gaza, your presence in Northern Gaza puts your life in danger. If you do not leave Northern Gaza, you will be considered a part of a terrorist organization and treated as such. Okay, if this is not the absolute definition, this is a copy that my own cousin got, so this is not something public necessarily. It's if this is not the definition of collective punishment of a population, I'm not sure what is, to tell a population that if you don't leave your home, you'll be considered a member of a terrorist organization. The most recent, I didn't have time to put this in the slide, but this happened just this morning. One of my cousins who tried to stay in her home in Northern Gaza because she has newborn twins in Northern Gaza just yesterday, just sent me a long message and told me that she witnessed with her own eyes as tanks surrounded her house, all of her neighbors, told them all they have to leave to the southern Gaza to walk the 20 miles to Rafah, surrounded them by threat of military assault, took all the men, gathered them up, stripped them down to their underwear, told them they had to walk the 20 miles in the cold of winter down to Rafah, while the children and the women were not stripped down, but also had to walk with whatever possessions they could put on their back. And this just happened. And my cousin's actually doing this trip as we speak right now. So how does this meld with the humanitarian crisis overall? So this is just a couple of important points. I'm not going to highlight all of them, but on average, before this assault happened, 500 plus truckloads of goods were entering Gaza each day. As of October 9th, Israeli officials announced a complete siege on Gaza. No food, water, or fuel was allowed to enter. The food market was bombed in Jabalia refugee camp, one of those 8 refugee camps. 5 United Nations food distribution centers were destroyed. Fishing activities were halted a couple days later, and the only power plant on October 11th in Gaza shut down on October 11th. 15,000 farmers risked loss of crop production. The complete siege, again, this did not happen passively. This humanitarian crisis happened because this complete siege on water, food. Remember, everything that enters is essentially through Gaza, through Israel. The last desalinization plant shut down October 17th. Contaminated water was essentially what was starting to be used. At this point, I was getting messages from my family saying they were eating animal feed. And that's really all they had to eat. They would go 24 hours without food. October 28th, 20% of the UN supplied bakeries in Gaza were bombed. The largest bakery in Gaza was bombed November 4th. And then just going through the most important things here, November 17th, humanitarian agencies unable to distribute essentials due to lack of fuel. 46 Israeli missile strikes on agricultural land. By November 25th, 1.7 million people were displaced from their homes, including all my family. Every one of my family members is displaced now from their homes. November 28th, agricultural losses of over 1 million a day. And then the World Food Program by December 3rd warns of a high risk of famine. And by December 9th, half of the people in Gaza are starving. And December 11th, heads of some of the world's largest humanitarian organizations say, quote, "We have never seen anything like the siege of Gaza." I'll try to speed up. I apologize if I'm running behind. Susie. So 500 trucks a day, again, on average was going in before. 60 trucks have entered per day since then. 60 trucks compared to 500, which was necessary just to maintain that brink of humanitarian disaster before October 7th. That means 83% of typical food and medicines haven't been allowed to enter. The average child in Gaza born into 2007 has experienced six different wars, 6 different attacks on Gaza. And this is on a backdrop of 61% poverty rates, 97%, water unfit for human consumption, inequal access to education and mental health issues. Over 130 days of bombing, there's been 28,000 Palestinians killed at this point, 360,000 units damaged, destroyed, 340 healthcare workers killed, 124 journalists, 12,000 and above children. Water, 97%, as I said, is unfit for human consumption. Remember, I showed you some of the data on water before. So remember, we said the WHO minimum is 100 liters per person per day. Gaza today, 3 liters. That's it. That's for everything. That's for drinking, food, for cooking, everything. 3 liters compared to the 100 that's necessary, or the minimum. Most Palestinians resort to drinking from agricultural wells. They're 30 times saltier than fresh water. 17,000 children are unaccompanied. In other words, they're orphans or can't find their parents. Some of the health statistics, almost 32,000 deaths, 24% of the healthcare facilities are functional, 77% are damaged, 126 ambulances damaged, 31% of children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza suffer from acute malnutrition. More than 1 million children are in need of mental health services. The UNICEF survey from December 26, 90% of children consuming less than 2 food groups. The food and water insecurity data, 1.1 million people face catastrophic levels of food insecurity, the highest level as assessed by human rights organizations. All wastewater treatment systems are non-operational, no access to clean water in northern Gaza at all. Anybody who drinks water, they find water bottles. Education, 625,000 children without access to education. 80% of the UNRWA UN Relief and Work Agency and public schools are damaged or destroyed. Most of the water, electrical, and communications infrastructure is beyond repair. Greater than 60% of the homes have been damaged. 1.7 million people, like we talked about, have been internally displaced. Almost 400 schools damaged. Over 50% of the roads have been damaged. 72% of the municipal facilities. Norwegian Refugee Council did an assessment in December. It said that it'll take over a year just to clear the rubble, and 7 to 10 years to rebuild the housing. That's if financing is available. And I'm going to close with just just a personal narrative from one of my cousins who sent this to me. And it just, again, this is all statistics, but this is human beings that we're dealing with. He said, as he sent this to me a while ago, he said, initially we were and still are suffering from a crisis of water and food. But this suffering, despite its magnitude, is considered trivial compared to the destruction of our lives, our future, and our hopes. This war has taken away our most beautiful memories. After everything beautiful in our lives was destroyed, our homes, our jobs, our friends, our neighbors, our belongings. And now we're wondering how we can continue our lives after the war, if we're still alive, with the pain, loss, sadness, and humiliation that we see, not to mention the destruction in homes, institutions, companies, and infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hadad. My condolences for your losses, and I'm so sorry that you and so many and millions of Palestinians have had to experience this. It is the story that unfortunately is not being told in the American media. It is the story that is not being told at universities, or in Congress, or in other venues where information is communicated. And when we do tell these stories like we do today, we will get attacked. And we'll be called all kinds of horrible, awful names. And we'll be insulted and we'll be accused of trying to hurt other people, specifically Jewish American communities, simply for expressing our own pain. So it is by the pain, you have a double pain that you experience, the actual pain itself, and then to be blamed for expressing that pain and that somehow you are harming those who are oppressing and causing the pain by complaining about it. And those in this specific example is the Israeli government. So I just want to say the quiet part out loud. And that's how racism works. So we have a few minutes left for Q&A, and I will start my questions, and then we will take some questions from the audience. So let me just make a few change. We're doing a hybrid event, so bear with me. So thank you, everyone who took the time to attend this timely event. We just barely scratched the surface. By hosting Mr. Josh Paul and Dr. Tariq Haddad to speak about U.S. defense policy toward Israel and the consequent humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we are intentionally talking about Palestine at universities, and we are intentionally pushing back against the bullies and those who seek to intimidate us at the People's Electric Law School by accusing us of all sorts of false, defamatory, slanderous names. Because in the United States, at a U.S. law school, we defend the U.S. Constitution, and that includes free speech, and that includes political freedom, and that includes the right to debate and disagree. And as we teach our law students, when you engage in ad hominem attacks, it means you have no argument, and you will lose in court. So although we are in the court of public opinion, we know that at the end of the day, if the facts are on your side, ultimately you will win the debate, at least for those who are interested in having a debate and listening to the facts, as opposed to manipulating and abusing the law in order to oppress other people and silence and censor them. And so with that, I am grateful to be here today with all of you. I'm proud to be the director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers Law School. And I encourage those in the audience to please support the center by making a donation, by going to csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button, and support us generously. Because you can vote with your money, you can vote with your voice, your vote, and your voice. And so with that, we will see you at our next lecture, which will be on April 10th with Dr. Zachary Foster discussing political Zionism. And on April 11th, we will be hosting Kenneth Roth, who is the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, who will also be providing an international legal analysis of the humanitarian crisis and the international humanitarian laws of war in Gaza. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to our Race and Rights podcasts, wherever podcasts are available. And with that, كل سنة وانتم طيبين. Ramadan Mubarak, and may peace be with you. Ma'as salam.